Sometimes love comes in the most unexpected ways, and sometimes it starts with heartbreak. In 1847, when families in Cedar Ridge couldn't feed their children, they made choices no parent should ever make. Mary Elizabeth Porter stood on that auction platform, watching her father's tears as strange men bid on her future. The winner was Silas McGraw, a mountain man who told her, "Cry all you want, only my heirs matter." Now Mary must follow this cold stranger into the wilderness, not knowing if she'll survive what comes next. He seems heartless, but the frontier has a way of revealing what's really inside a person. What happens when two broken souls are forced together in the harsh mountains? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra, special for you. The wagon wheels creaked through the mud as they left Cedar Ridge behind, each turn taking Mary Elizabeth Porter further from everything she'd ever known. She clutched her mother's worn Bible against her chest, its leather binding soft from years of faithful hands. The book was all she had left of home now, the only thing her father had allowed her to take when Silas McGraw paid his $23 for her hand. Silas rode beside the wagon on his massive bay horse, saying nothing. He was a mountain of a man, broad-shouldered and weathered, with dark hair that hung past his collar and a beard that hadn't seen scissors in months. His clothes were practical: buckskin pants, a heavy wool coat, and boots that had walked more miles than Mary could imagine. Everything about him spoke of the wilderness, from the rifle slung across his back to the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon. Mary had counted herself fortunate to avoid the attentions of some of the rougher men at the auction. Old Pete Hawkins had bid on her with whiskey on his breath and cruelty in his eyes. The Henderson boys had leered and made comments that brought heat to her cheeks. But Silas McGraw had stood apart from them all, silent and still as a pine tree, only speaking when the auctioneer called for final bids. $23, he'd said in a voice like gravel, and that was that. Now she wondered if his silence was worse than the other's crude words. The trail wound upward through stands of pine and aspen, the air growing thinner and colder with each mile. Mary had never been this far from town, had never seen mountains that seemed to scrape the very belly of the sky. The wagon jolted over rocks and roots, and she had to grip the sides to keep from being thrown out. "How much further?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Silas glanced at her, his grey eyes unreadable. Few more hours. The sun was low in the western sky when they finally reached his homestead. Mary's first glimpse of her new home made her heart sink. It was a log cabin, sturdy but small, nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, which meant someone had been tending the fire. A lean-to stable housed 2 horses and a milk cow, and she could see a vegetable garden plot, brown and dormant in the late autumn cold. It was neat and well-maintained, she had to admit. The logs were chinked tight against the wind, the roof looked sound, and firewood was stacked higher than her head along one wall. But it was so isolated, so utterly alone in this vast wilderness, that it might as well have been on the moon. Silas climbed down from his horse and tied the reins to a hitching post. Without a word, he began unloading her few belongings from the wagon. Mary sat frozen, uncertain what was expected of her. "Get down," he said, not unkindly, but with no warmth either. "This is home now." Mary climbed down on shaking legs. The mountain. Air cut through her thin dress, and she shivered. Silas noticed and grunted. "We'll get you proper clothes. Can't have you freezing before—" He stopped himself and picked up her small trunk. Before what? Before she gave him the heirs he wanted? The thought made her stomach turn. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly comfortable. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a fire crackling cheerfully. There was a kitchen area with a cast-iron stove, shelves lined with provisions, and a sturdy table with 2 chairs. A ladder led to a loft overhead. The main room held a rocking chair, a bookshelf filled with volumes, and in one corner, A bed. With a colorful quilt, Mary's eyes went to the bed and her cheeks flamed. She looked away quickly. Silas set her trunk down and pulled out his hunting knife, a magnificent blade with an elk horn handle, perfectly maintained and razor-sharp. He used it to cut the rope binding her belongings, his movements precise and economical. Even this simple task revealed something about him. He was a man who took care of his tools, who wasted no motion, who lived by discipline even in small things. "You'll sleep in the loft," he said, returning the knife to its sheath. "I'll take the main room." Relief flooded through her so suddenly her knees went weak. She'd feared the worst, that he'd claim his rights immediately, as was his legal privilege. Instead, he was giving her space, time to adjust. "There's a trunk up there with women's clothes," he continued. "They should fit well enough. He paused, his jaw tightening. "They belong to someone else. You can use them." Mary nodded, not trusting her voice. The clothes of another woman, his wife perhaps. Had she died? Run away? Mary didn't dare ask. Silas moved to the stove and began preparing what looked like a simple supper. "You can cook?" he asked without turning around. "Yes, sir. My mother taught me." "Good. Tomorrow you can take over kitchen duties. I'm better with traps and hunting than I am with making decent biscuits." He worked with the same economy of movement she'd noticed with the knife, everything purposeful and efficient. Soon the cabin filled with the smell of salt pork and beans, coffee and cornbread. Mary's stomach rumbled. She hadn't eaten since dawn. "Sit," Silas said, nodding toward the table. They ate in silence. The food was plain but nourishing, and Mary was grateful for it. She snuck glances at her new husband, for that's what he was now, legally if not in her heart. His hands were large and calloused from hard work, but he handled his fork with surprising delicacy. When he reached for the salt, she noticed a scar running from his wrist to his knuckles, white and old. "What happened to your hand?" she asked softly. Silas looked up, his expression guarded. "Bear," he said simply. Mary's eyes widened. She'd heard stories of mountain men wrestling bears, but she'd thought them tall tales. "A long time ago," he added, as if sensing her fear. "I was younger and more foolish then." After supper, he showed her around the cabin more thoroughly. The root cellar was well stocked with preserves, vegetables, and salted meat. The barn held tools, harness, and feed for the animals. Everything spoke of a man who planned ahead, who understood the harsh realities of mountain winters. "We're 15 miles from the nearest neighbor," Silas said as they stood outside in the gathering dusk. 25 from town. Come winter, we might not see another soul for months." The isolation pressed down on Mary like a physical weight. At home, she'd known everyone in town, could walk to the mercantile or the church whenever she pleased. Here she was trapped as surely as if she were in prison. "Don't think about running," Silas said quietly, and Mary startled. Could he read her thoughts so easily? "These mountains will kill you long before you find help. Stay close to the cabin, and you'll be safe." Safe. Mary wondered if she'd ever feel truly safe again. Back inside, Silas banked the fire for the night and lit a kerosene lamp. The golden light danced across the log walls, making the cabin feel smaller and more intimate. Mary stood uncertainly near the ladder to the loft, clutching her Bible. "The clothes are in the trunk by the window," Silas said. "There's a wash basin and pitcher up there too. You'll find everything you need." "Thank you," Mary whispered. He nodded and settled into the rocking chair with a book. Something about agriculture, she noticed. A man who read was not what she'd expected from a mountain hermit. Mary climbed the ladder to the loft. It was a cozy space under the eaves, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and the promised trunk. She opened it with trembling fingers and gasped. Inside were beautiful clothes, wool dresses, warm petticoats, even a lovely blue shawl. They were well made and clearly expensive, though they smelled faintly of lavender and disuse. Who had these belonged to? The question haunted her as she changed into a nightgown and knelt beside the narrow bed to say her prayers. She prayed for strength, for courage, for her father back in town. And despite everything, she found herself praying for the silent man downstairs, that whatever pain had carved those hard lines around his eyes might someday ease. Outside, the wind picked up, singing through the pines with a lonely sound that seemed to echo in her very bones. This was her life now, this cabin, this mountain, this stranger who owned her as surely as he owned his horses and cattle. But as she drifted off to sleep, clutching her mother's Bible close, Mary Elizabeth Porter couldn't know that the hardest trials and the greatest joys of her life were still to come. The mountain had its own ways of testing people, and sometimes, just sometimes, it rewarded those who proved themselves worthy with something precious beyond all measure. 3 weeks passed in quiet routine. Mary rose before dawn to tend the fire and prepare breakfast while Silas checked the animals and mended traps. She discovered he was a man of few words, but many responsibilities. There was always wood to split, repairs to make, preparations for the coming winter. She did her best to help, cooking meals, mending clothes, and keeping the cabin tidy. He treated her with distant courtesy, nothing more. They shared meals in silence, and he retreated to his books in the evenings while she sewed by lamplight in the loft. It was a lonely existence. But Mary began to find a strange peace in the rhythm of mountain life. The fear that had gripped her those first nights gradually eased into watchful acceptance. Then came the blizzard. Mary woke to an eerie stillness. The usual sounds of wind through the pines had vanished, replaced by a heavy, muffled quiet that seemed to press against the cabin walls. She climbed down from the loft to find Silas already up, standing at the window with his coffee cup in hand. "Snow," he said simply, but something in his tone made her look closer. Outside, fat white flakes fell so thickly she could barely see the barn 30 feet away. The storm had moved in during the night with the stealth of a hunting cat, and now the world was disappearing under a white blanket. "How long will it last?" Mary asked, joining him at the window. "Could be days, could be a week." Silas set down his cup and reached for his coat. "I need to check the animals, make sure they have enough feed. This looks like it might be a bad one." Mary watched him disappear into the swirling white, then busied herself with breakfast preparations. But as the hours passed and the storm showed no signs of letting up, she began to understand what trapped truly meant. The snow piled higher against the windows, muffling every sound from outside. When Silas returned from the barn, he had to force the door shut against the wind, and snow clung to his beard like frost. "Animals are secure," he reported, shaking snow from his coat. "We have enough firewood and food to last 2 weeks, maybe more if we're careful." 2 weeks. Mary tried to hide her dismay, but Silas noticed anyway. "You'll get used to it," he said. Not unkindly. "Winter up here isn't like winter in town. The mountain sets its own rules." By the second day, the snow had drifted nearly to the windows. Silas spent his time maintaining their equipment, sharpening tools, and reading. Mary found herself with little to do but cook and clean, tasks that took only a few hours each day. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the whisper of settling snow and the crackle of the fire. On the third day, desperate for something to occupy her mind, Mary began exploring the cabin more thoroughly. She'd been careful to respect Silas's privacy, but the enforced intimacy of the storm made such considerations seem foolish. He was reading in his chair, and she was looking for something, anything, to mend when she noticed a loose board in the wall near the kitchen. Behind it, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a small tin box. Mary glanced at Silas, but he seemed absorbed in his book. Her curiosity got the better of her judgment. Inside the box, she found a faded photograph. It showed Silas, years younger and clean-shaven, with his arm around a beautiful woman with dark hair and gentle eyes. Between them stood a boy of perhaps 7, with Silas's grey eyes and his mother's smile. All three looked happy, prosperous, loved. Mary's hands trembled as she stared at the image. Here was the answer to so many questions. The women's clothes upstairs, the second chair at the table, the way Silas sometimes paused mid-sentence, as if speaking to someone who wasn't there. "Put that back." His voice was quiet, but it cut through. The silence, like a blade. Mary spun around to find Silas standing behind her, his face carved from stone. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "Put it back." He stepped closer, and for the first time since their wedding day, Mary felt afraid of him. Not of physical harm. Something in his stillness told her he'd never raise a hand to her, but of the terrible pain she saw in his eyes. With shaking fingers, she rewrapped the photograph and placed it back in the box. Silas took it from her and returned it to its hiding place, his movements careful and precise. "They died," he said finally, his back still turned to her. "Cholera, 3 years ago. Sarah first, then little Thomas 2 days later." Mary's throat constricted. She'd imagined many things. A wife who'd run off, a woman who couldn't bear the isolation, even death by accident or wild animals. But this slow, agonizing loss of everything he'd loved most was worse than any of her imaginings. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Silas turned to face her, and she saw something raw and broken in his expression. "I built this place for them. Everything you see, the garden, the extra room I never finished, the books Sarah loved to read. I built it all for a family that's buried in Cedar Ridge Cemetery. Then why did you—" Mary stopped, but he understood. Her unfinished question. "Why did I buy you?" His laugh was bitter. "Because I'm a fool who thinks a man can replace what he's lost. Because I promised Sarah I'd have sons to carry on our name, and I kept that promise even after she couldn't hear it anymore." The honesty of his pain hit Mary like a physical blow. She'd thought herself the only victim in this arrangement, but she was wrong. Silas McGraw was as much a prisoner of his grief as she was of her circumstances. "You want to know the real reason?" "I put you in the loft," he continued, his voice growing rougher. "It's because I can't bear to have another woman in the bed where she died. Can't stand the thought of touching someone else, where I held her while she slipped away." Mary felt tears sting her eyes. "Mr. McGraw, Silas," he said heavily. "After 3 years of marriage, I think you can call me Silas." The word felt strange on her tongue. They stood in silence, the storm raging outside while a different kind of tempest raged between them. Finally, Mary found her voice. "I lost my mother when I was 12, she said softly. "Not the same as a wife and child, I know, but the grief doesn't go away. It just changes shape." Silas looked at her with surprise, as if he'd forgotten she might have her own sorrows. "She died in childbirth," Mary continued. "The baby, too, a brother I never got to know. Papa never remarried, never even looked at another woman. Said there was only one Catherine Porter in the world, and God had called her home." "Then why did he sell you to me?" The question was asked without accusation, just a weary need to understand. "Because grief makes people desperate," Mary said, "and desperate people make choices they never thought they could make." Something shifted in Silas's expression. For the first time, he seemed to truly see her, not as a replacement for his dead wife or a vessel for his hoped-for sons, but as a person with her own history of loss and pain. "I haven't been fair to you," he said quietly. "No," Mary agreed. "But I understand why now." They stood there in the lamplit cabin while the storm raged around them, two people who'd been brought together by desperation and circumstance, finally seeing each other clearly. It wasn't love. It was too soon, and they'd both loved before. But it was the beginning of something that might, in time, become understanding. Outside, the wind howled through the pines with lonely fury, but inside the cabin, something had shifted. The walls that grief had built around Silas McGraw's heart had developed their first small crack, and through it a glimmer of warmth began to seep in. When Mary climbed the ladder to the loft that night, she carried with her the image of a younger Silas with his family, happy and whole. And for the first time, she found herself hoping that someday, somehow, they might both find their way back to happiness, even if it looked nothing like what they'd lost. The storm finally broke on the 6th day, leaving behind a world transformed. Snow lay 3 feet deep across the clearing, turning familiar landmarks into strange, white sculptures. The silence was different now. Not the oppressive quiet of the blizzard, but the clean, crisp stillness of winter in the high country. Mary stood at the window, marveling at the beauty of it all. Icicles hung like crystal daggers from the eaves, and every pine branch was outlined in white against the brilliant blue sky. It was breathtaking and terrifying at the same time, so much beauty wrapped around such deadly cold. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Silas said, joining her at the window. His voice had lost some of its harsh edge since their conversation about the photograph. They'd been more careful with each other, speaking in measured tones, sharing small courtesies that felt like progress. "I've never seen anything like it," Mary admitted. In town, snow was just something that made the roads muddy. Silas, actually, smiled at that, a small thing, but the first genuine expression of warmth she'd seen from him. The mountain has its own way of showing off. Wait until you see sunrise on the peaks. He spent the morning digging paths to the barn and the woodshed, working with steady determination through snow that came up to his thighs. Mary watched from the window, noting how he moved with purpose and efficiency even in such difficult conditions. This was a man who knew how to survive, who'd learned to read the mountain's moods and work with them rather than against them. When he came inside for coffee, his cheeks were red with cold and his eyes bright with exertion. For a moment, Mary caught a glimpse of the younger man from the photograph, the one who'd built this cabin with hope in his heart. "I'll need to check the snares tomorrow," he said, pulling off his heavy gloves. "We've been eating through our meat stores pretty quick with this cold weather." Mary nodded, then hesitated. "Could I come with you? I've never seen how trapping works." Silas looked surprised. "It's cold work, hard walking in snow this deep. I'd like to learn. If I'm going to live here, I should understand how we survive." Something in her earnestness seemed to convince him. "We'll start you on snowshoes then. Can't have you falling through a drift and disappearing until spring." The next morning, Silas showed her a pair of snowshoes hanging in the barn, smaller than his own, clearly made for a woman. Mary tried not to think about who had worn them before as she strapped them on with trembling fingers. "They belonged to Sarah," Silas said quietly, anticipating her thoughts. "She liked to walk with me sometimes, especially in winter." "Said it was like being inside a snow globe." Mary looked up at him, surprised by this glimpse into his marriage. "She must have been very brave." She was. He adjusted the bindings on her snowshoes with gentle hands. "She came from back east, like you, took her time to learn mountain ways, but she was determined." They set out through the pristine snow, Silas breaking trail while Mary followed in. His footsteps. The snowshoes felt awkward at first, but she quickly learned the rolling gait that kept them from tangling together. The cold bit at her cheeks and made her breath puff white, but the exertion kept her warm. Silas moved through the winter landscape with the easy confidence of a man who belonged there. He showed her how to read animal tracks in the snow, the delicate prints of rabbits, the larger marks left by deer, the dangerous signature of wolves that made her shiver with more than cold. "The mountain feeds those who respect it," he explained, kneeling beside a carefully concealed snare. "Take only what you need, waste nothing, and it'll provide." They checked a dozen traps, finding 3 rabbits and a ptarmigan. Silas killed them quickly and cleanly, showing Mary how to field-dress the game with his ever-present hunting knife. His hands were gentle despite their size, treating even these small creatures with respect. "My mother always said to thank what feeds you," Mary said softly as she watched him work. Silas glanced at her with approval. "Smart woman, your mother. The mountain spirits appreciate gratitude." On the way back, Mary's legs began to shake with fatigue, but she pressed on without complaint. When they finally reached the cabin, she was exhausted but oddly proud. She'd kept up, learned something useful, and contributed to their survival. That evening, she prepared the rabbits, while Silas tended his traps and tools. she'd brought her. Mother's sewing kit with her from town, a small wicker basket containing needles, thread, scissors, and thimbles that had belonged to 3 generations of porter women. The tools felt familiar and comforting in her hands as she worked. "These need mending," she said, indicating several tears in Silas's shirts and pants. "And your coat has a hole near the shoulder." Silas looked up from sharpening his knife. "I'm not much hand with a needle." "Then it's fortunate I am." Mary threaded a needle with practiced ease. Mama always said a woman's stitches could hold a family together. As she worked, darning holes and reinforcing seams, Mary found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't since leaving town. This was something she knew how to do, a skill that had real value in their isolated life. Her small, neat stitches would keep the cold out and the warmth in, a contribution as vital as Silas's hunting and trapping. "You're good at that," Silas observed, watching her work. "I should be. I've been sewing since I was old enough to hold a needle without stabbing myself." Mary smiled at the memory. "Mama used to say that God gave women fingers nimble enough to mend what men were strong enough to tear." Silas chuckled, and the sound was like sunshine after rain. "Sarah used to say something similar, though she was terrible at darning. Could embroider flowers pretty as life, but ask her to patch a hole and she'd make it bigger." Mary felt a pang at this casual mention of his wife, but it was different from before, less like an intrusion and more like being trusted with something precious. "What was she like?" Mary asked carefully. Silas was quiet for so long that Mary thought he wouldn't answer. Then he set down his knife and leaned back in his chair. "She was light," he said finally. "Not just blonde hair and fair skin, though she was that too. She was light inside, always laughing, always finding something good in even the hardest days. When Thomas was born, she said he was proof that love could make itself visible." Mary's hands stilled on her sewing. The longing in his voice was almost painful to hear. "She sounds wonderful." She was. Silas picked up his knife again, but he didn't resume sharpening it. "She'd have liked you, I think, would have appreciated your practical nature." It was the first time he'd suggested Mary might fit into the life he'd built, even in some small way. The thought warmed her more than the fire crackling in the hearth. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the shutters and sending snow swirling past the windows. But inside the cabin, something had begun to grow. Not love, not yet, but the soil in which love might someday take root. Respect, perhaps, understanding, the recognition that they were both trying their best in an impossible situation. As Mary finished mending the last of his shirts, she realized that for the first time since the auction she felt useful. Not just a burden or a replacement for someone better, but a partner in the daily work of staying alive on the mountain. It was a small thing, but in her new life, small things had begun to matter more than grand gestures ever could. 2 weeks. Later, while organizing supplies in the root cellar, Mary discovered something that stopped her cold. Tucked behind a sack of flour, wrapped in a piece of flannel, was a small wooden cross, roughly carved but lovingly finished, small enough to fit in a child's hand. Mary lifted it carefully, running her fingers over the smooth wood. The craftsmanship was simple but heartfelt, the kind of thing a parent might carve for a beloved child. Her throat tightened as she realized what she was holding. "Find what you were looking for?" Mary jumped, nearly dropping the cross. Silas stood at the bottom of the cellar steps, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "I'm sorry," she said. Quickly, "I was just organizing the supplies, and this was behind the flour. I didn't mean to pry." Silas descended the last few steps and held out his hand. Mary placed the cross in his palm, watching his fingers close around it with infinite gentleness. "I made it for Thomas," he said quietly. "He was always losing things. Marbles, toy soldiers, his mittens, but he never lost this. Wore it on a string around his neck right up until—" He stopped, his jaw working as he struggled with the words. "He was holding it when he died," he finished. "Sarah put it in his hands before we buried him, but I couldn't stand the thought of it mouldering in the ground, dug it up the night after the funeral." Mary felt tears prick her eyes. The grief in his voice was so raw, so immediate, it might have been yesterday instead of 3 years ago. "He must have treasured it," she said softly. "He did. Used to tell people his papa made it special just for him." Silas's voice broke slightly on the words. "He was going to be 7 that winter. Old enough to come hunting with me," he said. "Old enough to be a real mountain man." They stood in the close confines of the root cellar, surrounded by the practical necessities of survival, while the weight of Silas's loss filled the space between them. Mary had heard grief before, in her father's voice after her mother died, in the keening of women who'd lost children to fever or accident. But she'd never stood this close to someone's broken heart, never felt the waves of pain rolling off another person like heat from a forge. "Tell me about him," she said impulsively. Silas looked up, surprised. "What?" "Tell me about Thomas. What was he like?" For a long moment, Silas just stared at her. Then, slowly, his face began to change. The rigid mask of grief softened into something that might have been gratitude. "He was trouble," Silas said, and there was the ghost of a smile in his voice. "Into everything, always asking questions. Why do the trees grow so tall, Papa? Why is the sky blue? Why can't I catch a fish with my bare hands like the bears do?" Mary smiled despite her tears. "He sounds like a wonderful boy." He was. Sarah used to say he got his curiosity from her side of the family and his stubbornness from mine. Silas turned the cross over in his hands, his thumb tracing the worn edges. He wanted to learn everything at once, how to trap, how to read, how to whittle, how to cook. Drove Sarah half crazy, following her around the kitchen, asking if he could help. They climbed out of the root cellar and into the main cabin, where Silas settled into his rocking chair with the cross still cradled in his palm. Mary busied herself with supper preparations, but she kept glancing at him, noting the way his shoulders had lost some of their rigid set. "The last thing I taught him was how to tie a proper knot," Silas continued, his voice growing stronger. "He practiced for hours, his little fingers getting tangled in the rope. But he was so proud when he finally got it right. Ran to show Sarah, shouting that he was ready to be a mountain man now." Mary set down her wooden spoon and turned to face him fully. "How did they get sick?" "Travelers came through in late summer, heading for California. We put them up for a few nights. Sarah always insisted on helping folks in need. They seemed healthy enough when they left, but a week later, Thomas started complaining his stomach hurt." Silas's voice took on the flat, recitative tone of someone telling a story they'd rehearsed too many times in their own mind. "Sarah got sick 2 days after that. High fever, terrible thirst. I rode to town for the doctor, but he said there wasn't much to be done except wait and pray. Thomas got worse fast. He was so little, couldn't fight it like an adult might. Sarah held on longer, but watching her boy die broke something in her. She just gave up after that." Mary's heart ached for him. To lose a child was terrible enough, but to lose both wife and son in the space of a few days, she couldn't imagine how he'd survived it. "I buried them side by side in the cemetery behind the church," Silas said. "Carved their headstones myself. Sarah McGraw, beloved wife and mother. Thomas McGraw, cherished son, taken too soon." That's all I could think to put. "It's perfect," Mary whispered. Silas looked at her with something like surprise. "You think so?" "I do. Sometimes the simplest words carry the most truth." They sat in comfortable silence while Mary finished preparing their meal. When she served it, Silas tucked the wooden cross into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. They ate quietly, but it wasn't the strained silence of before. It was the silence of two people who'd shared something important. After supper, as Mary cleared the dishes, Silas spoke again. "I haven't talked about them in 3 years. Haven't said their names out loud to another person since the day I buried them." Mary paused in her washing up. "Why now?" "Because," he stopped, seeming to search for the right words. "Because you asked, and because I think they'd want me to remember them with joy, instead of just pain." Mary dried her hands and came to stand beside his chair. "May I see it again?" "The cross?" Silas pulled it from his pocket and placed it in her outstretched palm. Mary studied it carefully, noting the way the wood had been sanded smooth, how the edges had been worn soft by small fingers that had rubbed it like a worry stone. "You can feel the love in it," she said finally. "Every line, every curve. This wasn't just carved, it was made with a father's whole heart." Silas's breath caught slightly. "Sarah said the same thing when I gave it to him." Mary handed it back, but not before pressing it gently to her own heart. "Thank you for telling me about them, for trusting me with their memory." Something shifted in Silas's expression then. A wall coming down, perhaps, or a door opening just a crack. Sarah always said that love shared was love multiplied. Maybe she was right. That night, as Mary climbed to her loft, she felt something had fundamentally changed between them. Not romance, they were still too raw, too careful for that, but a deeper understanding. She'd seen past his grief to the loving father and husband he'd been, and somehow, in the telling, he'd begun to see past his own pain, to remember the joy. Those relationships had brought him. Outside, the wind sang through the pines with its eternal lonely song. But inside the cabin, two wounded hearts had taken their first tentative steps toward healing. It would be a long journey, Mary knew, with setbacks and sorrows still to come. But for the first time since stepping onto that auction platform, she felt something that might, in time, become hope. The wooden cross rested in Silas's shirt pocket, close to his heart, no longer a symbol of loss, but a reminder of love that had been real and precious and worth remembering. And in her loft, Mary fell asleep thinking not of the life she'd lost, but of the possibility, however distant, of a life she might yet build. Spring came to the mountains like a whispered promise, slow and tentative at first, then gathering strength with each passing day. The snow began to retreat from the lower elevations, revealing brown earth hungry for sunlight. Streams that had been silent under ice began to sing again, their voices growing stronger as snowmelt swelled their banks. Mary had been on the mountain for 5 months now, and the rhythm of seasons had begun to feel natural. She'd learned to read the sky for weather, to preserve meat and vegetables, to tend the animals when Silas was away checking distant trap lines. Her hands had grown calloused from work, her body stronger from the physical demands of mountain life. But it was the letters that revealed the true depth of her transformation. She'd started writing them in the dark days of winter, when the isolation pressed too heavily on her spirits. Letters to her father, to her childhood friend Emma, to the life she'd left behind in Cedar Ridge. At first, they'd been filled with homesickness and uncertainty, but as the weeks passed, her words began to change. "Dear Papa," she wrote by lamplight. In her loft, "The mountain is beautiful beyond anything I could have imagined. Yesterday I saw a golden eagle soaring above the peaks, riding the wind currents with such grace it took my breath away. Silas says they mate for life and return to the same nesting grounds year after year. There's something comforting in that constancy. She never sent the letters. How could she? They were 15 miles from the nearest neighbor, 25 from town. But writing them helped her process the changes happening inside her heart. Changes she wasn't quite ready to admit even to herself. The bundle of unsent letters grew thicker as winter melted into spring. In them, she chronicled her growing skill at mountain tasks, her increasing appreciation for the wild beauty around her, and, though she wrote carefully around the subject, her slowly deepening feelings for the man who'd bought her like livestock, but treated her with growing respect. One morning in early April, as Mary hung laundry on the line behind the cabin, she noticed Silas watching her from the woodshed. There was something different in his expression, softer than the careful courtesy he'd shown her since the day they'd talked about the wooden cross. "You're humming," he said, when he approached with an armload of split wood. Mary paused, a damp shirt half-pinned to the line. She hadn't realized she was making any sound at all. "I suppose I was. Does it bother you?" "No." Silas set the wood down and studied her face. Sarah used to hum while she worked. I haven't heard that sound in this place for 3 years. There was no pain in his voice this time when he mentioned his wife. Just a quiet acknowledgement of memory. Mary felt something flutter in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine. "What was the song?" she asked. "I don't know. You were too far away to make out the tune." He moved closer, and Mary caught the scent of pine sap and honest sweat that always clung to him. "Sing it again." Mary felt heat creep up her neck. She'd always been shy about her voice, though her mother had praised it. "I couldn't, not with you listening. Please." The word was quiet, almost hesitant. "I'd like to hear it." So Mary sang, soft and low, the hymn her mother had loved, "Be Thou My Vision." Her voice wavered at first, then grew stronger as she lost herself in the familiar words. When she finished, Silas was standing very still, his grey eyes fixed on her face. "Beautiful," he said simply. Mary wasn't sure if he meant her voice or the song itself, but either way, the compliment made her pulse quicken. She turned back to the laundry to hide her confusion, and Silas began stacking wood against the cabin wall. They worked in companionable silence, but Mary felt his awareness of her like sunshine on her skin. That afternoon brought their first real crisis since the blizzard. Mary was in the root cellar, checking their remaining supplies and making notes for the garden she planned to plant, when she heard a commotion from the barnyard. Chickens squawking, the milk cow lowing in distress, and underneath it all, a sound that made her blood run cold, the snarling of wolves. She grabbed Silas's spare rifle from its hooks by the door and ran outside. 3 wolves circled the chicken coop, their winter-lean bodies desperate for easy prey. One had already killed 2 hens and was dragging them toward the tree line. The milk cow stood pressed against the barn wall, rolling her eyes in terror. Mary had never shot at a living thing larger than a rabbit, but there was no time to find Silas. He was up the mountain checking snares and wouldn't be back for hours. Their livelihood, their very survival, depended on those animals. She raised the rifle, sighted on the largest wolf, and fired. The shot went wide, but the sound sent 2 of the wolves racing for the woods. The third, emboldened by hunger, held its ground over the dead chickens and snarled at her. Mary reloaded with shaking hands, forced herself to breathe slowly, and fired again. This time, her aim was true. The wolf dropped where it stood. Mary stood in the sudden silence, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd done it, protected their home, saved their animals. But she'd also taken a life, and the weight of that settled on her shoulders like a yoke. She was still standing there, rifle in hand, when Silas came running down the mountain trail. He must have heard the shots and feared the worst. "Mary, are you hurt?" He reached her in a few long strides, his hands moving over her arms and shoulders, checking for injury. "I'm fine," she managed, "but the wolves, they were after the chickens." Silas looked past her to the dead wolf, then to the scattered feathers in the chicken yard, then back to her face. "You shot it?" Mary nodded, not trusting her voice. "Good girl." His approval was warm and immediate. "You did exactly right. Saved our flock, probably saved the cow too." He pulled her against his chest then, a brief, fierce embrace that surprised them both. Mary felt the solid strength of him, the rapid beat of his heart, the relief in his arms as they tightened around her. "I was so scared when I heard the shots," he murmured into her hair. "Thought something had happened to you." The admission hung between them as he pulled back, his hands still on her shoulders. For a moment, Mary thought he might kiss her. His grey eyes dropped to her lips, and she felt herself sway toward him. Then a chicken squawked indignantly from inside the coop, breaking the spell. Silas stepped back, his face flushing. "We should check the animals," he said roughly. "Make sure they're all accounted for." But as they worked together to calm the frightened livestock and repair the damage to the chicken coop, Mary felt the change between them like electricity in the air before a storm. Something had shifted in that moment when he'd held her. A recognition, perhaps, that what they felt for each other was growing beyond simple companionship. That night, as she wrote in her unsent letters, Mary found herself putting down words. She'd never dared write before. "Dear Emma," she wrote, "I think I might be falling in love. Not the desperate, girlish love we used to dream about, but something deeper and more complicated. He's a good man who's been hurt terribly, and I find myself wanting to heal those wounds, even as I discover my own strength. I don't know what will come of it, but for the first time since leaving home, I'm not afraid of the future." She folded the letter with the others and tied them with a ribbon she'd saved from her mother's sewing basket. Someday, perhaps, she might send them. But for now, they were just proof that Mary Elizabeth Porter was becoming someone new, someone brave enough to stand her ground against wolves, strong enough to build a life in the wilderness, and perhaps, just perhaps, wise enough to recognize love when it came wearing work clothes and smelling of pine sap. Summer brought abundance to the mountain, wildflowers carpeting the meadows, game trails rich with deer and elk, and Mary's garden flourishing beyond her wildest hopes. The vegetables grew with almost aggressive enthusiasm in the short growing season, as if making up for the long winter's dormancy. Mary found herself working from dawn to dusk, tending plants, preserving food, and preparing for another winter that seemed impossibly distant, but would arrive with brutal certainty. It was while hanging herbs to dry in the cabin's rafters that she found it, tucked behind a loose board near the kitchen window, wrapped in tissue paper so old it crumbled at her touch. Sarah's wedding ring. Mary's breath caught as she lifted the simple gold band from its hiding place. It was beautiful in its simplicity, worn smooth by years of wear and engraved inside with words that made her heart ache. S and S forever. 1843. She was still holding it, turning it over in her palm, when Silas came in from checking the horses. He stopped dead when he saw what she held. "Where did you find that?" His voice was carefully neutral, but Mary could hear the tension underneath. She showed him the loose board, the crumbling tissue paper. "I was hanging the mint to dry, and I noticed the board was loose. I thought maybe mice had gotten behind it." She held out the ring. "I'm sorry. I seem to keep finding things I shouldn't." Silas took the ring but didn't put it away immediately. Instead, he stood there looking at it, his thumb rubbing across the worn gold surface. "I put it there the day after she died," he said quietly. "Couldn't bear to wear it, couldn't bear to sell it, couldn't bear to look at it. So I hid it away. Like a coward." "You're not a coward," Mary said firmly. "You're a man who loved his wife and needed time to grieve." Time. Silas's laugh was bitter. 3 years, Mary. 3 years I've been hiding from everything that reminded me of her. And what do I have to show for it? A half-finished cabin, a heart full of cobwebs, and a woman I bought like cattle because I was too afraid to court someone properly. The harsh words hung between them like a challenge. Mary felt her own temper rise, a rare thing, but Silas's self-pity was wearing thin. "Stop it," she said sharply. Silas looked up, surprised by her tone. "Stop feeling sorry for yourself," Mary continued, her voice growing stronger. "Yes, you've been hurt. Yes, you've made mistakes. But you're not the only person in this cabin who's had to start over." She moved closer, her eyes blazing with an emotion she'd kept carefully contained for months. "You think I wanted to be sold at auction? You think I dreamed of being some mountain man's property, purchased to breed heirs, for a man who couldn't even look at me without seeing a replacement for his dead wife?" Silas flinched as if she'd struck him. "But I'm here," Mary pressed on. "I've made the best of it. I've learned your ways, tended your house, mended your clothes, shot wolves to protect what's ours. Yes, ours, because I've earned a place here, whether you acknowledge it or not." She was breathing hard now, months of careful politeness finally cracking under the weight of her frustration. "So don't you dare stand there with that ring and tell me you're a coward. A coward wouldn't have kept me safe all winter. A coward wouldn't have taught me to survive in this wilderness. A coward wouldn't have shared his grief with someone who needed to understand it." Silas stared at her, the ring forgotten in his palm. "Mary, I'm not Sarah," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "I'll never be Sarah. I'm Mary." Elizabeth Porter McGraw, and I'm tired of apologizing for not being someone else." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Mary's chest rose and fell rapidly, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She'd said too much, revealed too much, but she couldn't take it back now. "You're right," Silas said finally. Mary blinked, certain she'd misheard. "You're absolutely right," he repeated, his voice rough with emotion. "I have been a coward, and I have been treating you like a replacement instead of—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. "Instead of what?" Mary prompted. "Instead of the woman I'm falling in love with." The admission hung between them like something fragile and precious. Mary felt her anger drain away, replaced by a trembling hope she barely dared acknowledge. "Silas, I know it's not fair," he said quickly. "I know I have no right to ask for your heart when I bought your hand. I know you deserve better than a broken-down widower who's been too stubborn to see what's right in front of him." He opened his palm and looked down at Sarah's ring, then walked to the fireplace and set it carefully on the mantel. "But I need you to know that when I think about the future now, about next winter, next spring, the years ahead, I can't imagine them without you in them." Mary's heart hammered against her ribs. "As your wife, or as your property? As my partner?" Silas said, turning to face her. "As the woman who makes this cabin feel like home again. As the person I want to share my thoughts with at the end of the day and wake up beside when morning comes." He took a step toward her, then stopped as if afraid to presume. "I know I have no right to ask, but could you ever love me, Mary? Not as a replacement for the life you lost, but as the man I am now, scars and all." Mary looked at this man who'd become so much more than the cold stranger who'd bid on her at auction. She saw the grief that had shaped him, the loneliness that had driven him to desperate measures, but also the kindness he'd shown her, the respect he'd taught himself to give, the way his eyes lit up when she sang while working. "I already do," she whispered. The words were barely audible, but they hit Silas like a physical blow. He swayed slightly, his eyes closing as if in prayer. "Mary," she crossed the space between them and placed her hand on his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath her palm. "I love your strength and your gentleness. I love the way you carve beautiful things from rough wood. I love how you remember Sarah and Thomas with joy, instead of just sorrow now. I love that you see me, really see me, not just as a vessel for your hopes, but as myself." Silas's hand came up to cover hers, pressing it against his heart. "I want to court you properly," he said hoarsely. "I want to give you choice in this, real choice. Will you let me try to win your heart honestly this time?" Mary smiled through the tears she hadn't realized were falling. "You already have it, but yes, I'd like to be courted by the man I married." When Silas kissed her then, it was with the reverence of a man who'd found something precious he'd thought lost forever. And when Mary kissed him back, it was with the whole heart of a woman who discovered that love could grow in the most unlikely places, taking root in respect and blooming into something beautiful and true. Outside, the mountain wind sang through the pines, but inside the cabin, two hearts that had been broken by loss found healing in the promise of new love. Not a replacement for what they'd lost, but something entirely their own. The sound of hoofbeats on the mountain trail brought both Mary and Silas to the cabin window on a warm August morning. Visitors were so rare at their remote homestead that any arrival meant either good news or trouble, and given their isolation, trouble was more likely. Mary shaded her eyes against the morning sun and counted 3 riders approaching through the pines. As they drew closer, she recognized the lead horse and its rider, and her heart sank. "It's Judge Morrison," she said quietly, "from Cedar Ridge." Silas moved to stand beside her, his hand instinctively going to the rifle above the door. What would bring a judge up here? Mary had a sinking suspicion she knew exactly what would bring a judge to their mountain refuge, but she said nothing as the riders approached the cabin. Judge Morrison was a thin, severe man with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The two men with him wore deputy badges and looked uncomfortable in the wilderness setting. "Mr. McGraw, Mrs. McGraw," Judge Morrison called as he dismounted. "I apologize for the unannounced visit, but we have urgent legal business to discuss." Silas stepped outside, Mary close behind him. "Judge Morrison, what brings you so far from town?" The judge reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a leather portfolio. "I'm afraid it's a matter of some delicacy. Perhaps we could speak inside." Mary felt Silas's tension in the rigid set of his shoulders, but he nodded toward the cabin door. "Of course." Inside, Judge Morrison declined their offer of coffee and got straight to business. "I'm afraid there's been a significant legal irregularity regarding your marriage, Mr. McGraw." He opened his portfolio and withdrew several official-looking documents. "It's come to our attention that Robert Porter had no legal authority to arrange his daughter's sale, or marriage, as the case may be." Mary's blood ran cold. Beside her, Silas went very still. "What do you mean?" Silas asked carefully. "I mean, Mr. McGraw, that according to territorial law, a father cannot sell his daughter into marriage without proper documentation of financial guardianship and court approval. Mr. Porter was acting outside his legal rights when he arranged this transaction." Judge Morrison spread the papers on their kitchen table. "Furthermore, we've received testimony from several townspeople that Miss Porter, Mrs. McGraw, was coerced into this arrangement without her free consent." Mary found her voice. "Who gave testimony?" "Mrs. Henderson, the minister's wife, Mrs. Calloway from the Mercantile, several others who witnessed your distress at the auction." The judge's tone was not unkind, but it was implacable. "They filed a formal complaint alleging that this marriage was arranged under duress and without proper legal standing." "What does that mean for us?" Silas asked, though Mary could hear in his voice that he already suspected the answer. "It means, Mr. McGraw, that in the eyes of the law, this marriage is void." The words fell into the cabin like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through everything Mary thought she understood about her life. "Void," she whispered. "Completely without legal standing," Judge Morrison confirmed. "Mrs. McGraw, or rather Miss Porter, you are free to return to Cedar Ridge immediately. Your father has already arranged accommodation for you with the minister's family until more permanent arrangements can be made." Mary stared at the legal documents, the official seals and signatures that apparently had the power to erase 8 months of her life with the stroke of a pen. "And if I don't want to return? Miss Porter, I understand this situation may seem comfortable to you now, but you must consider your reputation, your future prospects for a legitimate marriage." "This is a legitimate marriage," Silas interrupted, his voice dangerously quiet. Judge Morrison shook his head. "Not according to territorial law, Mr. McGraw, and I'm afraid the situation is more complex than simple legalities. Your payment to Mr. Porter for his daughter's hand constitutes technically participation in human trafficking, a serious federal crime." The words hit like physical blows. Mary saw Silas's face drain of color. "However," the judge continued, "given the unusual circumstances and your apparent good treatment of Miss Porter, the territorial government is prepared to overlook the criminal aspects of this case, provided you cooperate fully with her return to proper society." Mary felt the world tilting beneath her feet. Everything she'd built here, her growing love for Silas, her sense of belonging on the mountain, her identity as a capable frontier woman, could be swept away by legal documents she'd never seen before. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked. "Oh, quietly. I'm afraid there's no decision to be made, Miss Porter. The law is quite clear. However, I understand this is a shock, so I'm prepared to give you until tomorrow morning to gather your belongings." "And if she chooses to stay?" Silas asked. Judge Morrison's expression grew stern. "Then you would be harboring someone who's been declared legally free of an invalid contract, Mr. McGraw. That could be construed as kidnapping, regardless of her stated wishes." The legal trap was elegant and complete. Mary was free, but only if she left everything she'd come to love behind. After the judge and his deputies departed, with promises to return the next morning, Mary and Silas sat at their kitchen table in stunned silence. The legal documents lay scattered between them like weapons. "They're right," Silas said finally, his voice hollow. "What your father did was wrong. What I did was wrong. You should have had a choice from the beginning." Mary looked at this man. She'd grown to love, saw the defeat in his shoulders, the way he wouldn't meet her eyes. "I'm having a choice now," she said firmly. "No, you're not. You heard the judge. If you stay, I become a criminal. I won't have that hanging over us, Mary. I won't have you trapped here by threats and legal complications." Mary stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "So you're just going to let them take me away? After everything we've built here? After telling me you love me?" "Because I love you," Silas said, finally looking at her. "Because you deserve better than a life built on illegal foundations. Because you deserve the choice to make your own future, without coercion or fear." Mary felt tears of frustration sting her eyes. "And what if my choice is you? What if my choice is this life we've made together? Then you'd be throwing away your chance at a legitimate future for a broken-down mountain man who was fool enough to buy a bride instead of earning one." The self-loathing in his voice broke Mary's heart. She moved around the table and knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. "Listen to me, Silas McGraw. You are not broken down. You are not a fool. You are a good man who made a desperate choice in a desperate time, just like I did when I agreed to it." She squeezed his hands tightly. "But that's not who we are now. We're not the desperate people who made that bargain 8 months ago. We're the people who've built something beautiful together, who've learned to love despite the circumstances that brought us together." "Mary, I'm not leaving," she said, firmly. "I don't care what the law says. I don't care what Cedar Ridge thinks is proper. This is my home. You are my husband in every way that matters, and I choose to stay." Silas pulled his hands free and stood, moving to stare out the window at the mountains that had sheltered them both. "If you stay, I'll always wonder if it's because you love me or because you feel trapped by circumstances. And you'll spend the rest of your life cut off from respectable society, branded as the woman who chose to live in sin with a man who bought her at auction." The pain in his voice was almost unbearable, but Mary heard something else underneath it, hope, carefully buried but still alive. "Then we'll have to prove them all wrong," she said quietly. "We'll have to show them that love can grow from the strangest seeds and become something real and lasting and true." She moved to stand beside him at the window, looking out at the wilderness that had become her refuge and her home. "But first, you have to decide what you want, Silas. Do you want me to stay because it's easy, or do you want me to stay because you can't imagine your life without me in it?" As the sun set behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, two people who'd found love in the most unlikely circumstances faced the choice that would define the rest of their lives together. That night, Mary sat in her loft, surrounded by the tangible proof of the life she'd built on the mountain. Her sewing basket held mended clothes and half-finished projects, a quilt made from scraps of fabric that told the story of their months together. Pieces of Silas's old shirts, worn beyond repair, but too precious to waste. Fabric from her mother's. Dresses, carefully preserved and incorporated into something new. Even scraps from Sarah's clothes from the trunk, added with reverent care after Silas had given his permission. Each stitch represented a choice, a moment when she'd decided to build rather than merely survive. The quilt was almost finished now, large enough to cover their bed. Their bed, she thought defiantly, not just Silas's temporary accommodation of an unwanted guest. Downstairs, she could hear Silas moving restlessly through the cabin. He'd been pacing since supper, stopping occasionally to stand at the window or stoke the fire unnecessarily. She knew he was wrestling with the same questions that plagued her: duty versus desire, law versus love, the safe path versus the true one. Mary folded the quilt carefully and climbed down the ladder. Silas was sitting at the kitchen table, the legal documents spread before him again, as if studying them might reveal some loophole Judge Morrison had missed. "Come to bed," she said, softly. Silas looked up, his eyes dark with pain. "Mary, I can't. Not tonight. Not when everything is so uncertain." Mary moved to stand behind his chair, her hands resting on his shoulders. "Then don't think about tomorrow. Just be here, now, with me." She felt the tension in his muscles, the weight of responsibility he carried like a stone in his chest. Slowly, gently, she began to work at the knots in his shoulders, the way she'd learned to ease the soreness from long days of physical labor. "You don't have to carry this alone," she murmured. "We're in this together, whatever comes." Silas leaned back against her touch, his eyes closing. "I don't know what's right anymore, Mary. All I know is that the thought of losing you feels like losing Sarah and Thomas all over again." "Then don't lose me." Mary's hands stilled on his shoulders. "Fight for me, Silas. Fight for us. Against the law, against the entire territorial government, against anyone who thinks they know what's best for our lives better than we do." Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached up and covered her hands with his. "Tell me what you're thinking. Really thinking, not just what you think I want to hear." Mary came around to face him, pulling a chair close so their knees were almost touching. "I'm thinking that I've never felt more alive than I do here with you. I'm thinking that I was dying slowly in Cedar Ridge, suffocating on propriety and expectations, and I didn't even know it until I came here and learned to breathe free." She gestured toward the window, where moonlight painted the peaks silver. "I'm thinking that this mountain has made me stronger, braver, more myself than I ever was in town. And you," she reached out to touch his face, "you've shown me what it means to be truly seen and valued, not for what I can do for someone else, but for who I am." "Mary, I'm also thinking," she continued, "that love this real, this deep, doesn't come along often. And when it does, you don't throw it away because a piece of paper says it's inconvenient." Silas captured her hand, pressing it against his cheek. "What if I can't protect you from the consequences? What if choosing me ruins your life? What if not choosing you ruins it instead?" Mary challenged. "What if I go back to Cedar Ridge and spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been, married to some respectable man who sees me as a duty instead of a joy?" They sat in the lamplight, hands clasped between them, while the weight of the decision settled around them like snow. Finally Silas spoke. "If we do this, if we face them together, it won't be easy. We'll be outcasts, Mary, pariahs. No respectable family will acknowledge us. No church will welcome us. Our children, if we have them, will carry the stigma of our choice. Our children will know they were conceived in love between two people who chose each other freely," Mary replied firmly. "They'll know their parents fought for their right to be together. That seems like a good foundation to me." Silas stood and moved to the fireplace, where Sarah's ring still sat on the mantel. He picked it up, holding it to the light. "Sarah would have liked you," he said quietly. "She would have understood why I love you." Mary felt tears prick her eyes. At the gentle acceptance in his voice, "She would want you to be happy," Mary said. "She would want you to choose love over fear." Silas nodded slowly, then walked to the window and opened it wide. The night air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and wild roses. Without ceremony, he drew back his arm and threw Sarah's ring out into the darkness. "I choose love," he said. Simply, "I choose you. I choose us." Mary crossed to him and took his hands. "Then we need a plan." They spent the rest of the night at the kitchen table, mapping out their strategy. By dawn, they had decided on a course of action that was audacious, risky, and completely dependent on Mary's courage and Silas's reputation among the mountain folk. "Are you sure about this?" Silas asked, as the first light of morning crept through the windows. "Once we start down this path, there's no going back." Mary looked around the cabin that had become her true home, at the books they'd read together, the table where they'd shared meals, the quilt hanging half-finished in the loft that represented all their hopes for the future. "I'm sure," she said, firmly. "This is where I belong. You are who I belong with." And if we have to prove that to Judge Morrison and all of Cedar Ridge, then that's what we'll do." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their planning. Judge Morrison and his deputies were returning earlier than expected, probably hoping to catch them unprepared. "Remember," Silas said quietly as they moved to the window, "let me do most of the talking at first. When the time comes, you'll know." Mary nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. Everything they'd planned, everything they hoped for, would be decided in the next few minutes. Judge Morrison dismounted with the same officious bearing as the day before, but something in his expression suggested he expected this to be a simple matter of collecting Mary and her belongings. He was about to discover how wrong he was. "Good morning, Judge Morrison," Silas called from the cabin doorway. "I trust you slept well in town." "Well enough, Mr. McGraw. I trust Miss Porter has had time to prepare for her departure?" "Actually," Silas said calmly, "we've had time to prepare something else entirely." He stepped aside, and Mary emerged from the cabin. But instead of the submissive, defeated woman Judge Morrison expected to see, she stood tall and proud, wearing her finest dress, one of Sarah's that she'd altered to fit perfectly. In her hands, she carried a leather portfolio of her own. "Judge Morrison," she said with quiet dignity, "I have some documents I'd like you to review before we proceed." The judge's eyebrows rose. "Miss Porter, I'm afraid there's nothing to review." "The law is quite clear." "The law is indeed clear," Mary interrupted smoothly, "which is why I've taken the liberty of researching it thoroughly." She opened her portfolio and withdrew several handwritten pages covered in her neat script. According to Territorial Statute 47B, a marriage entered into under duress may be voided, but only if the injured party petitions for such relief within 6 months of discovering the duress. Judge Morrison's confident expression began to waver. "Miss Porter, I hardly think I've been aware of the circumstances of my marriage since the day it occurred," Mary continued relentlessly. "It is now 8 months later, by the statute of limitations outlined in territorial law. I have forfeited my right to claim duress as grounds for voiding this marriage." She handed him a page covered with legal citations she'd painstakingly copied from Silas's law books. Furthermore, according to Territorial Statute 23-C, any marriage that has been consummated and cohabitated for more than 6 months is considered legally binding, regardless of the initial circumstances, provided both parties consent to its continuation. The color was draining from Judge Morrison's face as he scanned her research. "Miss Porter, surely you don't intend—" "I intend to remain with my husband," Mary said firmly, "of my own free will, with full knowledge of my legal rights, and in complete defiance of anyone who presumes to know my own mind better than I do." Judge Morrison sputtered, looking between Mary and Silas as if they'd grown second heads. "This is highly irregular." "What's irregular," Silas said, stepping forward, "is a territorial judge attempting to dissolve a legal marriage without a petition from either party involved. The complaints filed by the townspeople have no legal standing," Mary finished. "Unless I petition for relief, which I will not, this marriage stands as valid under territorial law." She pulled out another document, this one official-looking with a wax seal. "I took the liberty of riding to the territorial courthouse in Millerville last week, while my husband was hunting. This is a signed affidavit stating my intention to remain married, filed with the territorial clerk." Judge Morrison stared at the document as if it might bite him. "You rode to Millerville alone?" "I did. 26 miles through mountain passes to ensure my marriage was properly documented according to territorial law." Mary's smile was sweet but steely. "I'm quite capable of taking care of myself, Judge Morrison, as my husband can attest." For the first time since this ordeal began, Silas smiled, a broad, proud grin that transformed his entire face. "She shot a wolf, Judge," he said conversationally. "Saved our livestock, makes the best cornbread this side of Denver, and she's twice as smart as any man who thinks he can tell her what to do with her own life." Judge Morrison looked frantically through his own papers, as if searching for some legal precedent to override Mary's research. Surely the territorial government has an interest in preventing what? Mary asked quietly. A woman from choosing her own husband. A marriage that has brought happiness to two people who found each other in difficult circumstances. A union that has harmed no one and enriched the lives of both parties. She stepped closer to the judge, her voice growing stronger with each word. Or perhaps the territorial government has an interest in perpetuating the idea that women are property to be disposed of by their fathers and reclaimed by their betters. When convenient, the accusation hung in the morning air like a challenge. Judge Morrison realized he was facing not a helpless victim, but a formidable adversary who had armed herself with the very laws he'd intended to use against her. I warn. You, Miss Porter, Mrs. McGraw, this course of action will make you outcasts from respectable society. Mary looked around at the mountain wilderness that had become her sanctuary, at the man who'd become her partner in every sense of the word, at the life they'd built with their own hands and hearts. Judge Morrison, she said with quiet satisfaction, I can't think of anything I'd like more. Judge Morrison's face had gone from confidence to confusion, to barely contained anger in the space of Mary's legal recitation. He shuffled through his papers once more, then fixed her with a stern glare. Mrs. McGraw, he said, emphasizing her married name with obvious reluctance. Even if your legal arguments have merit, which I'm not conceding, there remains the matter of public morality. The good people of Cedar Ridge are concerned about the example your situation sets. The example of what? Mary asked. Two people finding love and building a life together through honest work and mutual respect? The example of a woman living in unseemly circumstances with a man who purchased her like livestock, Judge Morrison snapped, his judicial composure finally cracking. The words hung in the air like a slap. Mary felt Silas tense beside her, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle he'd left leaning against the cabin wall. But before either of them could respond, they heard something that made them all freeze. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses approaching fast through the trees. Silas moved protectively in front of Mary as a group of riders burst into their clearing. Mary's heart sank as she recognized them. Her father, Robert Porter, the Henderson brothers who'd bid on her at auction, and several other men from Cedar Ridge. All were armed, and none looked like they'd come for a friendly visit. There she is, called out Pete Henderson, pointing directly at Mary. There's the girl we've come to rescue. Robert Porter dismounted heavily, his face set in grim lines Mary remembered from her childhood when she'd disappointed him. Mary Elizabeth, get your things. You're coming home where you belong. Papa, Mary started, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture. Don't papa me, girl. Do you have any idea the shame you've brought on our family? The whole territory's talking about Robert, Porter's daughter who chose to live in sin with the mountain man who bought her. Mary felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. I've brought no shame on anyone, Papa. I've made an honest life with my husband. Husband? Pete Henderson spat, dismounting with his brother Jake close behind. That's no husband. That's a man who paid coin for a woman like she was a broodmare. Silas's hand was definitely on his rifle now, though he hadn't raised it yet. I'll ask you to watch your language in front of my wife. Henderson. Wife? Jake Henderson laughed harshly. She's no more your wife than my horse is. You want to pretend this arrangement is respectable, McGraw? Fine, but the rest of us know what you really are. Mary felt the situation sliding toward violence with each exchanged word. The men from town were angry, self-righteous, and armed. Silas was outnumbered, but on his own ground, with the advantage of knowing every tree and rock in these mountains. Judge Morrison looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Gentlemen, Judge Morrison said, clearly attempting to regain control of the situation. I appreciate your concern for Miss Porter's welfare, but this is a legal matter. Legal. Matter nothing, Robert Porter interrupted. This is about a father's right to protect his daughter from a man who's taken advantage of her innocence. Mary stepped forward, placing herself between the two groups of men. "Stop, all of you, just—"
"Stop!"
Her voice carried clearly across the clearing, and something in her tone made even the angry men from town pause. "Papa, you had no right to sell me," she said quietly, "but that's done now, and I've made my peace with it. More than that, I've found happiness in it." "Happiness?" Robert Porter's voice was full of disbelief. "Mary, you can't possibly understand what you're saying. This man bought you. He owns you like property." "No," Mary said firmly. "He freed me." She gestured toward the cabin, toward the garden she'd planted, toward the life visible in every carefully tended detail of their homestead. "He freed me from being just Robert Porter's daughter, from being just a burden you couldn't afford to keep. He freed me to discover who Mary McGraw could be, a woman strong enough to survive in the wilderness, capable enough to contribute to building something, lasting, brave enough to choose love over security." Pete Henderson sneered. "Pretty words, girl, but you're still just a mountain man's whore pretending to be a wife." The insult hung in the air for exactly one heartbeat before Silas moved. His rifle came up smooth and fast, the barrel trained directly on Pete Henderson's chest. "Apologize," Silas said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of deadly calm that spoke of a man who'd killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. "Apologize to my wife, or I'll put a hole in you big enough to drive a wagon through." Pete Henderson's face went white, but his brother Jake and several other men reached for their own weapons. In seconds, half a dozen rifles were pointed in various directions across the small clearing. "Silas." "No," Mary said urgently, stepping toward him. "Don't let them make you into the monster they want you to be." But Silas's attention was focused entirely on Pete Henderson, and Mary could see the fury building in his grey eyes, not just at the insult to her, but at months of suppressed anger over the circumstances that had brought them together, the injustice of their situation, the frustration of being judged by people who understood nothing of what they'd built together. "I said apologize," Silas repeated, his finger moving to the trigger. Mary's hand went to the chain around her neck, beneath her dress, where she wore her most precious possession, her mother's locket. The gold was warm against her fingers, smooth, from years of her mother's touch. Inside was a tiny portrait of her parents on their wedding day, young and hopeful and in love. "Wait!" she called out, her voice cutting through the tension like a bell. "Please, all of you, just wait." Something in her tone, perhaps the desperation, perhaps the dignity, made the armed men pause without lowering their weapons. Mary pulled the locket from beneath her dress and held it up so it caught the morning sunlight. "This was my mother's," she said clearly. "The only thing of real value my father ever gave me. It's worth more than the $23 you paid for me, Silas." She looked around the circle of tense, angry faces. "It's also worth more than all your self-righteous indignation, Papa, and more than your crude insults, Pete Henderson." With deliberate care, Mary unclasped the chain from around her neck. "I'll trade it for safe passage. All of you, Judge Morrison, Papa, the Henderson brothers, everyone from town, you turn around and ride back to Cedar Ridge. Leave us in peace, and I'll give you this locket as payment for your trouble." Robert Porter stared at his daughter, in shock. "Mary, that locket your mother made me promise—" "Mama made you promise to take care of me," Mary interrupted. "Not to control me, not to sell me to the highest bidder when times got hard, to take care of me." She held the locket higher, letting it swing in the sunlight. "Well, I've been taken care of, Papa, just not the way you intended." Mary turned to face Silas, whose rifle was still trained on Pete Henderson. "Silas, lower your weapon, please, for me." For a long moment, husband and wife stared at each other across the clearing. Mary could see the war in his grey eyes, the protective fury, the mountain man's instinct to defend his territory, and his woman, warring against his love for her, and his desire to be the man she believed him to be. Slowly, very slowly, Silas lowered his rifle. "That's right," Mary said softly, "because we're not the people they think we are. We're not the desperate people who made a bargain at that auction. We're the people who built something beautiful from that desperate beginning." She looked around the circle again, her voice growing stronger. "You want proof that our marriage is real? You want proof that love can grow from the strangest seeds?" Mary held out the locket toward Pete Henderson. "Here's your proof. I'm willing to give up the most precious thing I own, my last connection, to my mother, to buy peace for the man I love. That's not the action of a woman living in shame. That's the action of a wife protecting her husband and her home." Pete Henderson stared at the offered locket, his face working with conflicting emotions. Behind him, his brother Jake looked confused, as if the script he'd expected this confrontation to follow had suddenly changed. "I don't want your damn locket," Pete muttered. "Then what do you want?" Mary challenged. "Really? What did any of you come here expecting to accomplish?" Judge Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Miss Porter, Mrs. McGraw, the territorial government simply wanted to ensure you weren't being held against your will, and now you know I'm not. The townspeople wanted to rescue you from an unseemly situation," Robert Porter added weakly, "and I've shown you that I don't need rescuing." Mary turned to Pete Henderson. "And you? What did you want, Pete?" Pete Henderson's face was red with embarrassment and anger. I thought, hell, Mary, you could have had any man in town if you'd just waited a little longer. Respectable. And men who'd have courted you proper. Men like you?" Mary asked quietly. Pete's flush deepened. "Maybe," Mary nodded thoughtfully. "Men who saw a pretty girl they wanted to possess. Men who would have married me for my cooking and my father's approval and my ability to give them sons." She gestured toward Silas, who was still holding his rifle at the ready, but pointed at the ground. "This man sees me, Pete. He knows I'm not just pretty, I'm strong. He knows I'm not just useful, I'm necessary. He knows I didn't choose him because he was respectable or safe or approved of by the neighbors. I chose him because he's the only man who's ever looked at me and seen not what I could do for him, but who I could become with him." Mary clasped the locket back around her neck, the gold settling against her heart where it belonged. "So here's what's going to happen," she said with quiet authority. "You're all going to get back on your horses and ride home. You're going to tell the good people of Cedar Ridge that Mary McGraw, not Mary Porter, Mary McGraw, is exactly where she chooses to be. And if anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with territorial law." She moved to stand beside Silas, close, enough that their shoulders touched. "Because this is my home, this is my husband, and this is my choice, and I'll fight anyone who tries to take it away from me." The silence that followed was broken only by the wind in the pines and the distant call of a hawk circling high above the peaks. One by one, the men from town began to lower their weapons, the fight going out of them in the face of Mary's unwavering certainty. Judge Morrison was the first to holster his pistol completely. "I believe we have our answer, gentlemen. Mrs. McGraw has made her position quite clear." Robert Porter looked at his daughter for a long moment, his expression cycling through disappointment, confusion, and finally, reluctant respect. "You're sure about this, Mary? Truly sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Papa." He nodded slowly. "Then I suppose I wish you happiness." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was acceptance, and for now that was enough. 1 year later, on a crisp autumn morning that painted the mountainsides in shades of gold and crimson, Mary stood at her kitchen window watching Silas work in their expanded garden. He was harvesting the last of the winter squash, his movements easy and unhurried in the way of a man completely at peace with his place in the world. Mary's hand rested on her rounded belly, feeling the active baby within respond to her father's voice as he called a greeting to the milk cow. She was 6 months along now, and Silas had taken to talking to her stomach every morning, telling their unborn child about the mountain, the seasons, the life they were building together. "Good morning, little one," he'd whispered against her belly just that morning. "Your mama's making pancakes today, and the maple trees are showing off their finest colors just for you." Mary smiled at the memory, then turned her attention to the wooden box on the kitchen table. Inside, carefully. Preserved in tissue paper were two matching wooden rings that Silas had carved during the long winter evenings. They were simple but beautiful, made from the heart of an ancient pine that had fallen near their cabin, smooth and warm to the touch. Today was their real wedding day, the one they'd chosen for themselves, witnessed by the mountain and blessed by their love instead of legal necessity. The sound of approaching horses made Mary look up from the rings, but without the fear such sounds had once brought. These were expected visitors. Old Pete from the trading post, bringing supplies and news from the outside world, and behind him a smaller figure on a familiar bay mare. Mary's heart lifted as she recognized her father. Robert Porter had ridden up the mountain once a month since their confrontation with Judge Morrison, each visit a little easier than the last. He still didn't fully understand her choice, but he'd begun to respect it, and more importantly, to see the happiness it had brought her. "Mary!" he called as he dismounted. "You're looking well." Mary stepped outside, one hand supporting her back as she navigated the porch steps. Her father's eyes went immediately to her expanded figure, and his face softened with an emotion she'd rarely seen there, grandfatherly anticipation. "Hello, Papa. I'm glad you could come." Silas appeared from around the cabin, his arms full of vegetables. "Mr. Porter, Pete, good to see you both." The relationships had taken time to develop, but they were genuine now. Robert Porter had begun to understand that Silas McGraw was not the crude mountain hermit he'd imagined, but a man of intelligence, integrity, and deep love for his daughter. Old Pete had simply been delighted to discover that the mysterious mountain man was actually a good customer and better company than most of the folks he dealt with in town. "Brought your winter supplies," Pete announced, gesturing to the pack mule behind him, "and some news that might interest you." Mary and Silas exchanged glances. News could be good or troublesome, depending on its source. "Judge Morrison's been replaced," Pete continued with obvious satisfaction. "New territorial judge rode in last week, a woman if you can believe it. Judge Sarah Catherine Walsh. First thing she did was review all of Morrison's questionable cases." Mary felt Silas's hand find hers and squeeze gently. "Turns out," Pete went on, clearly enjoying himself, "our Mrs. McGraw's legal research was spot on. Judge Walsh officially ruled that any marriage entered into before her appointment and maintained for more than a year is legally binding regardless of initial circumstances. Made it territorial precedent." Mary's breath caught. "What does that mean?" "Means you're married, legal and proper by order of the territorial court," Robert Porter said quietly. "No questions, no qualifications, no asterisks, just married." Mary felt tears of relief sting her eyes. She'd learned to live with the uncertainty, the knowledge that their happiness existed outside the bounds of social approval. But to have that burden lifted completely was a gift she hadn't dared hope. "There's more," Pete added with a grin. "Seems Judge Walsh took a dim view of Morrison's attempt to separate a legally married couple. She's initiated an investigation into his conduct. Word is, he might face sanctions." Silas laughed, the sound rich and warm. Justice has a sense of irony after all. They spent the afternoon in celebration, a simple feast made from the bounty of their land, shared stories, and the quiet satisfaction of battles won and peace earned. As evening approached, Robert Porter and old Pete prepared to return to town before dark. "Mary," her father said quietly as he prepared to mount his horse, "I owe you an apology. For the auction, for not understanding, for thinking I knew what was best for your life better than you did." Mary hugged him carefully, her belly making the embrace awkward but heartfelt. "You did what you thought you had to do, Papa. We all did. But look how it turned out." Robert Porter looked around at the thriving homestead, at his daughter's obvious happiness, at the son-in-law who'd proven himself worthy of the precious gift he'd been given. "Better than I ever could have planned," he admitted. "Your mother would be proud." After their visitors left, Mary and Silas stood together on their porch, watching the sun set behind the peaks. The mountains rose around them like cathedral walls, painted purple and gold by the dying light. "Ready?" Silas asked, pulling the wooden rings from his pocket. Mary nodded, her heart full of gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. They spoke their vows quietly, words they'd written themselves about choosing each other freely, about building love from mutual respect, about promising to face whatever challenges came as partners in every sense of the word. When Silas slipped the wooden ring onto her finger, Mary thought of all the circles in their life, the seasons that brought them from desperate strangers to beloved companions, the daily routines that had woven them together, the completeness they'd found in each other. "I love you, Mary McGraw," Silas said, his voice rough with emotion. "From that first day when you stood up to those wolves, to this moment when you're carrying our child, you've been the bravest, strongest, most beautiful woman I've ever known." "I love you too," Mary whispered, slipping his ring onto his work-calloused finger. "For seeing past what I was supposed to be to who I could become. For building this life with me, piece by piece, choice by choice." As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they went inside to their home, the cabin that had sheltered their growing love, the kitchen where they'd shared thousands of meals, the bed where they'd found comfort in each other's arms, and would soon welcome their first child. The wooden rings caught the lamplight as Mary finished her quilting, adding the final stitches to the coverlet that would warm their family for generations to come. Each piece of fabric told part of their story, scraps from worn-out work clothes, pieces from treasured garments, remnants of old lives transformed into something new and beautiful. Just like them. Outside, the mountain wind sang its eternal song. Through the pines, but inside the cabin, two hearts beat in perfect rhythm, keeping time to a love that had been tested by law and society and emerged stronger for the trials. They'd proven that the human heart could not be bought or sold, that true love could grow in the most unlikely soil, and that sometimes the best things in life came not from careful planning, but from the courage to choose happiness over safety, love over convention, hope over fear, and high above them the ancient peaks stood silent witness to their joy, keeping watch over all the wild and wonderful things that flourished in the freedom of the mountains.